The year doesn't announce itself. It simply arrives, quiet as breath on cold air, while the world keeps carrying yesterday in its pockets. In St. Peter's Square, that quiet feels louder. The stones hold centuries of footsteps, and today they hold a crowd wrapped in scarves, flags, rosaries, and private worry. New Year's Day always has that strange double exposure, celebration laid over dread, like glitter sprinkled on a bruise. People come anyway, some to be close to God, some to be close to other human beings, some just to begin the year in a place that doesn't wobble. Cameras sweep the square the way tides sweep a shoreline, collecting faces from every direction. Grief sits beside gratitude. Hope leans against exhaustion. Everyone is waiting for something that can't be bought, a sense that time can mean more than repetition. Then Pope Leo XIV appears, calm, almost understated, and the square subtly changes temperature. Not because the sun shifts, but because attention does. The silence before his voice is its own kind of statement. His first words are exactly what you expect on January 1st, a simple greeting, offered like warmth. And then, he says it again, not louder, not sharper, just again, as if he's asking the crowd to feel the weight of the phrase instead of letting it slide past like confetti. And that's when the turn happens. Quick moment, if you love Pope Leo XIV, click the subscribe button now, drop a comment with where you're watching from and share your thoughts. He doesn't speak as though time is harmless. He speaks as though time can be wasted, sanctified or squandered, depending on what a human heart decides to do with it. The months will keep their rhythm, he implies, but God is not interested in a year that merely repeats itself. God is calling for something harder, a renewal of time itself, an era shaped by peace and friendship rather than habit and harm. Then the hook tightens, because he names the part no one wants to hear on a holiday. If we don't desire the good of others, we may as well be turning paper. Calendars fill. Diaries crowd with plans. And still nothing truly changes. In that moment, the square isn't just attending a prayer. It's being diagnosed. The world loves the feeling of a fresh start and quietly resists the cost of becoming new. And Pope Leo XIV is about to describe that cost in plain terms, how hope is cultivated, how peace is built, and why the most powerful force in a violent world can be almost silent. Because to understand what he is really asking of this year, we have to begin where the day itself begins, the square like the world's front porch, the air full of unspoken conflicts, and a blessing that refuses to stay decorative. The square has its own weather. Not just the cold that presses into fingertips and makes people rub their hands together as if friction could summon warmth, but a deeper climate, made of expectation. St. Peter's Square is built to hold multitudes, and it does. Yet on mornings like this, it also holds something harder to measure, the invisible weight people bring when they come to a place they believe can bear it. The obelisk stands in the center like a needle pinning time to stone. The colonnade curves outward, those long arms of Bernini, wide enough to welcome the whole world and old enough to make you feel the world has been trying to heal itself for a very long time. Even the pigeons seem subdued, hopping and lifting off in short bursts, as if the air is heavy with unsaid things. New Year's Day is supposed to be clean. That's the story we tell ourselves. Midnight arrives and somehow the slate is wiped. But the crowd gathered here doesn't look like a people arriving to receive a clean page. It looks like a people arriving with ink already on their hands. There are flags, bright blocks of color that flash when the wind catches them, yet the faces beneath them are not the faces of a party. They are the faces of people who have lived through a year and are not entirely sure how to step into another one without bringing the last 12 months with them. Their breath rises like smoke from small fires. The light is winter thin, the kind that makes everything look honest. Cameras move with practiced precision. Lenses tilt toward the basilica, toward the windows, toward the balcony where the words will come from. Screens glow in palms. Microphones are tested. Somewhere a producer makes a final adjustment that no one here will ever notice, but which will shape how millions of people will experience this moment. Even silence, in an age like this, has handlers. And yet, despite the media, despite the crowd, despite the architecture that practically demands awe, the mood is strangely intimate. Not because the square is small. Because the human heart is. A man stands with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, staring toward the basilica as if trying to remember what it feels like to trust anyone's words. A woman presses her rosary through her gloves, each bead a small insistence, I'm still here. I still want something good to be true. A young couple huddles close, sharing warmth, their faces turned upward with that fragile blend of hope and fear that comes from believing life can be different and not knowing how to make it so. Some have traveled a long way. You can tell by the way they look around, taking in the square like a person arriving at the edge of a dream. Others are locals, moving with a quieter familiarity, as if this place is not a dream but a refuge. And then there are the ones who seem neither dazzled nor comfortable, people who came because the world beyond these stones has become too loud, too sharp, too quick to break. They all share the same instinct, to begin the year somewhere that feels anchored. Because outside this square, the world does not look anchored. It looks restless, nations locked into old conflicts that refuse to fade, new conflicts that arrive without warning, political speeches that sound like weapons, families split by arguments that never resolve. It looks like a planet learning to speak in outrage more fluently than in mercy. It looks like children who grow up faster than they should because adults around them can't stop fighting. It looks like loneliness dressed up as independence. It looks like the ache of people who are tired of starting over, tired of making promises they don't know how to keep. New Year's Day doesn't erase any of that. It simply highlights it. The contrast becomes unbearable, fireworks in the sky, and fear in the chest. Champagne on tables, and bitterness in the mouth. Happy New Year on lips, and unsaid grief behind the eyes. That is why this square feels like the world's front porch. Because it is where private burdens sit beside public ones. Because it is where you can stand among thousands and still feel as alone as your own thoughts. Because it is where people come not just to witness a ritual, but to be oriented, to be told, by someone they believe speaks with authority, whether the world can be steered away from its worst instincts. The crowd waits with a patience that is not passive. It is the patience of people who know that words can matter, and who also know that words can fail. Time moves differently in the waiting. Minutes stretch. The cold makes every small motion deliberate, the tug of a scarf higher over a mouth, the shift of weight from one foot to another, the slow lift of a phone to record a moment that might feel too large to trust to memory alone. Somewhere a child asks a question, and an adult answers in a whisper, as if even curiosity should not disturb the air. Then the square changes. Not dramatically. Not with a roar. With something subtler, a collective attention tightening, like fabric drawn. A wave of movement ripples through the crowd as heads tilt, bodies lean, eyes sharpen. It's the sound before sound, the way a room feels when someone important has entered, even if you cannot see them yet. Pope Leo XIV appears. There is no theatrical flourish. No attempt to inflate the moment. He arrives with the calm of someone who does not need the crowd's energy to be powerful. His presence is not loud, it is firm, settled, unmistakable, like a hand placed gently on a shoulder that has been trembling. The applause comes, because that is what crowds do when they recognize authority. But what follows is more telling. The applause does not linger into noise. It falls away into silence quickly, almost respectfully, as if people sense that the weight of this moment cannot be carried by clapping. And then he speaks. He begins with what every person here expects. A greeting, warm and ordinary, offered as if it were a small blanket against the cold. Dear brothers and sisters, Happy New Year. The words are simple enough to be automatic, something you could say to a stranger in the street. But spoken here, in this place, with the square listening and the world tuned in, the simplicity has an unexpected effect. It doesn't feel small. It feels careful. And then he repeats it. Not to fill time. Not to perform. The repetition lands like a pause made audible. As if he is refusing to let the phrase become a reflex. As if he is asking the crowd to notice the difference between wishing something and willing something. There is a tiny shift in the square, no one moves, but everyone feels moved. Because repetition does something the modern world rarely allows, it slows you down. It makes the familiar strange again. It creates a pocket of stillness where meaning can actually arrive. Only then does the turn begin. He speaks of the months, the rhythm of them, the way they pass in their steady order whether we are ready or not. The calendar will do what calendars do. It will flip and fill an end and begin again. The world will keep moving forward in time even if the human heart remains trapped in old cycles. But he refuses to treat that rhythm as neutral. He does not speak as though time is merely a backdrop for our lives. He speaks as though time is a moral arena. As though each day is not just a date but a choice, an opportunity to build or to destroy, to heal or to harden. The Lord, he insists, invites humanity to do more than endure the passing months. Humanity is being called to renew its times, to usher in something that doesn't arrive automatically, an era of peace and friendship among all peoples. And then he says the line that tightens the air. Without the desire for the good of others, he suggests, there would be no point in turning the pages of the calendar at all. No point in filling diaries with plans, goals, resolutions, schedules. Because what are those pages, really, if the heart remains unchanged? Paper can hold appointments. Paper cannot hold peace. The square absorbs it. You can almost hear the thought moving through the crowd, he isn't blessing the year. Not only. He's evaluating it. He's evaluating us. There is a subtle discomfort that moves like wind through a row of flags. Because people like New Year's Day precisely because it makes them feel innocent. It offers a reset without demanding repayment. It lets us believe we can become better without admitting how we became worse. But the Pope's words strip away the illusion gently, the way a careful doctor strips away denial, with precision, not cruelty. The world loves fresh starts. It loves the language of renewal, new goals, new habits, new hopes. But it is suspicious of conversion. It is wary of any kind of change that reaches past the surface and into the machinery of the heart. He begins to name what that deeper change actually looks like. He points to the Jubilee that is nearing its end, not as a ceremonial closing, but as evidence. A case study. A lesson. Hope, he suggests, is not a mood you wake up with. It is cultivated. It is practiced. It is learned through concrete transformations, not abstract intentions. Wrongs can become forgiveness. Pain can become consolation. Resolutions of virtue can become good works, real actions that leave marks on the world. Even that phrasing carries a quiet sting, because it implies that the opposite has also been happening, wrong staying wrong, pain staying pain, virtue staying safely theoretical. It implies that people have been content to admire goodness from a distance rather than to enact it. An enactment is costly. Forgiveness costs pride. It costs the sweetness of resentment. It costs the right to replay the injury like a private movie. Consolation costs attention. It costs time. It costs stepping into someone else's suffering without making it about yourself. Good works cost comfort. They cost excuses. They cost the convenient belief that someone else will handle it. The Pope does not say these costs like threats. He says them like facts. Like the laws of spiritual gravity. The crowd listens in a different way now. At first, they arrived hungry for blessing, something to crown the day with meaning. But now they are being handed something closer to a responsibility. The square feels less like a stage and more like a mirror. People begin to hear the message not as a general statement about humanity, but as a personal question with sharp edges. Do you desire the good of others, or only your own peace of mind? That question reaches farther than politics, farther than headlines. It travels inward, toward the places people keep hidden even from themselves. Toward the habits that have hardened into identity. Toward the grudges tucked away like valuables. Toward the small violences that are never called violence because they are subtle, dismissal, contempt, cold silence, careless words that cut and then pretend they didn't. This is why the square feels tense without becoming noisy. Because everyone is being confronted without being singled out. Everyone is being invited without being flattered. And in that invitation there is another unsettling reality: peace, in this framing, is not someone else's job. It is not the property of diplomats alone, or the project of distant leaders, or the work of those more holy than the rest. It is not a decoration hung over the doorway of a new year like a festive wreath. Peace is something built. And building means labor. It means materials. It means choosing, again and again, to place something solid where chaos wants to spread. The square, in its silence, begins to feel like a construction site. Not of stone, but of conscience. The cold sharpens the moment. The winter light makes every face clearer. It is as if creation itself is refusing to blur the edges of the question. The year has turned, yes, but has anything else turned? The Pope's presence remains steady. His voice carries without strain. He does not rush. He does not entertain. He does not try to outrun the discomfort. He lets the words do their work. And that work is not applause. It is interior movement. You can sense it in the way the crowd grows quieter, not because it is losing interest, but because it is gaining weight. People stop fidgeting. Phones lower slightly. The spectacle of being present gives way to the seriousness of listening. Somewhere in that listening, the familiar comfort of ritual begins to fall away. The square is still St. Peter's Square. The Pope is still the Pope. The Angelus will still be prayed. The shape of the event remains recognizable. But something has been deliberately stripped down, the assumption that this is merely ceremonial. Because if time is not neutral, then prayer is not neutral either. If the year is not simply a sequence of dates, then a blessing is not simply a beautiful ending to a gathering. A blessing becomes a commissioning. And commissionings are never comfortable. As the Pope continues, the crowd begins to realize the day is not going to end with a sentimental wish. It is going to end with a mandate disguised as mercy. A peace that cannot remain a word. A new year that cannot remain a page. A faith that cannot remain private. The square, for a moment, feels like it's holding its breath, not waiting for the next line, but bracing for what the next line will demand. And that is where chapter 1 closes, with the realization settling across the cold air like a thin layer of snow. This year has been greeted, yes. But it has also been claimed. And the cost of that claim is about to be named in full. Pope Leo XIV did not let the crowd rest in abstraction. He did not leave them with a poetic thought about renewal and then move on as if the word peace could float above life like incense. He anchored it. He gave it weight. He began to talk the way builders talk, about material, method, and cost. He returned to the jubilee that was nearing its end. Not as a farewell. Not as a commemorative ribbon to tie around the past year. He spoke of it as evidence, proof that hope is not a mood that visits the lucky and abandons the weak. Hope, he implied, is cultivated. It is practiced. It is trained the way a muscle is trained, through repetition and resistance, through choices that feel small in the moment and decisive in their accumulation. The word jubilee could have sounded like a ceremonial closing, something to applaud, something to archive. But in his mouth it became a workshop. A case study in how a new world is built. He did something almost unsettling in its simplicity. He named the reversals. Wrongs, he said, can be transformed into forgiveness. Pain can be turned into consolation. Resolutions of virtue can become good works. The square listened, and for a moment it felt as if those arrows, the quiet movement from one reality to another, were being drawn across the air itself. Because each reversal was a refusal to let the world stay stuck. Each one insisted that what is broken is not beyond repair. But none of them were effortless. None of them could be outsourced to time. That was the point. Forgiveness is not what happens when anger gets bored. Consolation is not what happens when suffering fades. Good works are not what happens when virtue is admired. All of it requires conversion, an interior turning that is both spiritual and practical, a turning that eventually shows up in the way someone speaks, the way someone spends, the way someone stops themselves from doing the easy harm. In that sense, the Jubilee was not a celebration of how far humanity had come. It was a lesson in how far humanity still had to go, and how to walk the distance. The Pope's tone stayed calm. But calm, in this square, did not mean soft. It meant controlled. It meant he was not improvising. He was laying beams. And then he moved from hope to peace, as if the two were inseparable, because they are. Hope is the insistence that change is possible. Peace is what that change looks like when it becomes real. He began to dismantle the crowd's most common instinct. On New Year's Day, people like peace the way they like snow in a city park, beautiful, gentle, harmless, something that makes the world look cleaner without asking anyone to do anything. The word peace often arrives wrapped in sentiment, cardstock peace, holiday peace, decorative peace. He stripped that wrapping away. Peace, he insisted, is built. Not announced. Not wished. Built. Brick by brick, decision by decision, restraint by restraint. And once you say that, once you say peace is built, you are forced to talk about what threatens it. You are forced to name violence. Not only the violence that makes headlines, but the violence that lives closer to home, the violence of contempt, the violence of humiliation, the violence of speaking as if another person's dignity is optional. The violence of silence used as punishment. The violence of enjoying the righteousness of anger more than the difficulty of repair. Even the most disciplined listeners felt the sting of recognition. Because there is a kind of violence that wears respectable clothing. It lives in habits. It hides inside jokes. It becomes normal, and because it becomes normal, it becomes invisible. Pope Leo XIV's words made it visible again. If time is not neutral, then neither are the daily choices that shape time. Peace cannot be a seasonal greeting because violence is not seasonal. It is habitual. It is practiced. It is rehearsed, sometimes in nations, sometimes in homes, sometimes inside a single heart. That is why peace must also be practiced. The square, already quiet, grew quieter still, not from boredom, but from attention deepening into something like examination. People came looking for a blessing. Many were finding themselves invited into accountability. And then, just when the message could have stayed in the realm of moral instruction, demanding, yes, but still somewhat external, still something a person could interpret as for the world out there, Pope Leo moved the lens. He brought Mary into the center. It was January 1st. The calendar had flipped. But Christmas, he reminded them without needing to say it outright, was not finished. The light of the Nativity still shone. The Church was still standing inside that mystery, God entering the world not through conquest, but through closeness. Mary was not introduced as distant porcelain. Not as a decorative figure pressed into stained glass. He spoke of her as the first witness, the first keeper of the unspeakable fact, that the Lord of history chose to begin as helplessness. Her womb was the setting. Not a palace. Not a battlefield. A womb. Silence, not spectacle. concealment, not parade. And in that silence, he placed an image that did not behave like religious rhetoric usually behaves. It did not thunder. It did not burn. It did not flash. It pulsed. He spoke of Christ as the word of life in Mary's womb, not arriving like a storm, but like a heartbeat of grace. A heartbeat. The square felt that word in the body before it could fully think it in the mind. A heartbeat is not a metaphor you can keep at a safe distance. It is intimate. It is biological. It is the sound you associate with life itself, steady, vulnerable, unstoppable. And suddenly, the title's promise began to reveal its shape, the silent power of peace. Because a heartbeat is power without noise. It is strength without performance. It is persistence without domination. A heartbeat does not negotiate with violence. It simply continues. It refuses to be interrupted. It does not prove itself with volume. It proves itself with life. In that image, power was reframed. Not as winning. Not as overpowering. Not as bending the world through force. Power as steady mercy. Power as restraint with purpose. Power as a living rhythm that refuses to mimic the world's loudest instincts. It was a twist, and it landed quietly, the way the most profound things often land, without the mind realizing immediately how much has shifted. And then he did something even more unsettling. He widened the heartbeat. He spoke as if the heart of Jesus does not choose sides the way human hearts choose sides. He spoke as if that heart beats not only for the ones we instinctively gather close, but also for the ones we are tempted to push away. It beats for the shepherds, simple, ready, responsive, the kind of people the world overlooks until they become convenient symbols. And it beats even for herd, the one who hears about innocence and responds with fear, who hears about a child and thinks about a threat, who represents the part of humanity that would rather destroy what it cannot control. The crowd had heard stories like that before. But hearing it framed this way, hearing it placed inside the living image of a heartbeat, made it harder to sentimentalize. Because if Christ's heart beats for both, then the listener is no longer allowed to divide humanity cleanly into deserving and undeserving. The listener is no longer allowed to outsource mercy only to the people who feel safe. It beats for the righteous to persevere. And it beats for the unrighteous to change their lives and find peace. That was the moral shock. Justice, in this framing, was not exclusion. It was invitation. Not permission to remain as you are, but a door held open long enough for you to walk through it. It unsettled the square in a different way than the earlier challenge about calendars. That earlier challenge threatened comfort. This one threatened tribal instincts. Because most people can accept a call to do good as long as good stays within the borders of their chosen circle. Most people can accept peace as long as peace can be reserved for their side. But peace that refuses to choose sides, peace that insists on the dignity of the one you would rather label an enemy, this kind of peace demands a conversion deeper than behavior. It demands a conversion of imagination. Who do you believe is reachable? Who do you believe is worth praying for? Who do you believe is capable of change? When the heart of Christ beats for both shepherd and herd, it does not erase accountability. It intensifies it. Because it implies that no one is allowed to remain the same, not the righteous, not the unrighteous. Everyone is being pressed toward transformation. Everyone is being asked to stop living as if violence is inevitable. And that's when the battlefield shifted again. Pope Leo turned outward. He spoke of the World Day of Peace and called for prayer to rise for nations blooded by conflict and suffering. The names of wars did not need to be spoken for their shadows to appear. The crowd carried them already: images, headlines, personal connections, the global ache that arrives each time a new tragedy becomes news and then becomes normal. People prayed, because prayer is what a crowd like this knows how to do when faced with distant horror. Prayer creates connection across borders. It resists helplessness. It insists that suffering is not invisible. But the Pope did not let the crowd stay comfortably distant. He turned inward. He spoke of peace not only as a geopolitical need, but as a domestic necessity. He called prayer also for families wounded by violence or pain. And in that sentence, the square changed shape. Because it collapsed the scale. It was one thing to pray for nations at war. You could stand in the square and aim your compassion outward, toward places you might never visit. You could feel the moral clarity of caring about global suffering. It was another thing entirely to hear the word violence placed beside the word family. Because that made the battlefield immediate. It made it personal. It made it unavoidable. Kitchens. Bedrooms. Living rooms. Dinner tables where words become weapons. Hallways where silence becomes punishment. Childhood memories where fear is stored. Marriages where small resentments grow like mold in corners. Parents who carry wounds they never learn to name and pass them on like inheritance. Children who learn early that love can be unstable. The Pope's words did not accuse any single person. But they refused to let the crowd pretend that peace is only a public matter, something handled by governments and treaties. Peace must exist where a child cries at night. Peace must exist where a couple speaks without cruelty. Peace must exist where someone learns to stop repeating the harm they once endured. Peace must exist in the private places where the world's violence is first rehearsed. It was a profound discomfort, not because it was harsh, but because it was true. And in the face of that truth, the crowd could no longer remain simply the crowd. Listeners began to become individuals again. A man who came thinking about global conflicts suddenly thought about the argument he hadn't resolved with his brother. A woman who came with a flag and a camera suddenly thought about the way she speaks when she's tired, the sharpness that comes out like a reflex. Someone who came seeking protection suddenly realized that protection is not the same as peace, and that peace requires more of them than being safe. The message had followed them inward. It had slipped past the defenses that ceremonial language often allows. It had moved from Rome's cold air into the warm, messy rooms of ordinary life. And that is the strange miracle of a moment like this: nothing happens in the way modern life defines happening. No fireworks. No sudden spectacle. No visible transformation in the square itself. People remain standing. The Pope continues speaking. The cameras keep rolling. And yet, everything shifts. Because a real message doesn't merely inform. It reorders. The silence in St. Peter's Square grew heavier, not empty, but active. The kind of silence that is doing work inside a person. The kind of silence that makes you feel your own heartbeat and wonder what it has been beating for. The crowd had come as spectators to a ritual that would mark the year. Now, they were being reshaped into participants in a construction project they could not escape. Peace was no longer a word to receive. It was a responsibility to carry. And as the Pope's voice moved toward the prayer that would gather all of this, toward the Angelus that would turn diagnosis into surrender, the square stood in that active silence, changed in the only way that matters first. Not by leaving. By listening differently. By realizing that the heart at the center of this day refuses to choose sides, and therefore refuses to leave any human heart untouched. The silence in St. Peter's Square had become a kind of architecture. It was no longer merely the absence of noise. It had shape. It had weight. It pressed gently against the crowd, holding them in place the way a hand holds something fragile. People stood as if the ground beneath them had shifted from stone to responsibility, and no one wanted to move too quickly in case the moment cracked. Pope Leo XIV let that silence stand. He did not rush to relieve it. He did not soften what had already been said. Instead, he brought the message back to its center with a line so familiar it could have passed unnoticed, except nothing about it passed unnoticed now. He returned to his greeting. Not Happy New Year, but the older, deeper greeting that lives underneath every Christian year, every Christian day, every human conflict: peace. Peace be with you all. The words landed in the square with the quiet finality of a seal pressed into wax. People had heard them before, at Mass, in sermons, in passing. But here, after everything he had unfolded, the greeting did not feel like a polite religious custom. It felt like a claim about reality. And then he sharpened it. He named the kind of peace he meant, the kind the world rarely trusts because it cannot be weaponized. Peace that is unarmed. Peace that disarms. At first, the phrases sounded almost paradoxical, like a riddle. But the meaning gathered quickly, like a tide finding its level. This was not peace achieved by threatening violence more effectively than your opponent. Not peace built on fear of consequence. Not peace maintained by domination. This was peace without weapons in its hands, and therefore peace that takes weapons out of other hands, not by force, but by refusing to play the same game. It was the primary climax of the day because it exposed the world's deepest habit: we believe safety comes from being able to hurt. We believe security is kept by keeping the option of destruction close. Unarmed peace breaks that logic. Disarming peace breaks something even more intimate, the reflex in the heart that reaches for control the moment it feels afraid. And Pope Leo named where such peace comes from. Not from human cleverness. Not from perfect treaties. Not from the temporary exhaustion of enemies. Peace, he said, is God's gift, unconditional love given without negotiation. But then came the line that made the gift feel like a weight: the gift is entrusted to human responsibility. That was the sting inside the blessing. If peace is merely a gift, people can admire it the way they admire sunlight, grateful, passive, uninvolved. But if peace is a gift placed into your hands, then you become accountable for what you do with it. And that accountability did not stay abstract for long. You could feel it in the square. The crowd did not applaud. Not because they disagreed. Because applause would have been too easy. Applause would have turned the message into performance, something you consume and then discard. Instead, there was silence. And that silence was the loudest moment of the event. It was the silence of people hearing themselves addressed. The silence of someone realizing they cannot say, "Yes, peace is important," and then continue living exactly as before. The silence of a year being handed a task rather than a decoration. The Pope held the moment steady, as if giving the square time to understand what unarmed truly costs. Restraint costs. Forgiveness costs. Courage costs. To live unarmed is not to be weak. It is to refuse the cheap strength of retaliation. It is to refuse the private weapons people polish every day: sarcasm, contempt, humiliation, the pleasure of being right, the pleasure of winning an argument at the price of another person's dignity. Disarming peace does not only apply to nations. It applies to voices, to messages, to tone, to the way a person enters a room determined to dominate it. And suddenly the illusion that peace belongs to diplomats alone collapsed completely. Because if peace is unarmed and disarming, then peace must be practiced everywhere weapons are used, even when the weapons are invisible. A father's harshness. A spouse's cold withdrawal. A friend's betrayal carried like a knife in the pocket. A co-worker's quiet sabotage. A stranger reduced to an enemy because they're different. The battlefield had widened in chapter 2. Now it came close enough to feel on the skin. The year's assignment was not to feel more peaceful. It was to become the kind of person who could carry peace into places where peace does not naturally survive. And that, in a world addicted to force, is demanding. Pope Leo XIV did not pretend otherwise. He spoke as though he trusted the crowd with the truth that peace is not fragile because it is weak, but because it is pure. It cannot be mixed with violence without losing its nature. It cannot be treated as an accessory without becoming a lie. Then, with the message laid out like a foundation, he did something that changed the entire temperature of the square. He stopped explaining. He began to pray. The shift from speech to prayer was subtle, almost seamless, yet it felt like crossing a threshold. The crowd had been listening to a diagnosis and a mandate. Now they were being led into surrender, into the place where human effort meets divine mercy, where responsibility meets grace. The Angelus began. The words were familiar, almost ancient in their predictability. The angel of the Lord declared unto Mary. A prayer said countless times. A rhythm known by heart. But in this context, the familiarity did not make it safe. It made it sharper. Because the Angelus is, at its core, a story about how God enters history. Not with armies. Not with thunder. Not with coercion. Through consent. Through humility. Through flesh. Through a young woman saying yes. In the square, those lines took on a new kind of danger, not danger like threat, but danger like truth that refuses to be ignored. If God chose consent over force, then force is not the language of salvation. If God chose closeness over conquest, then conquest is not holy, no matter how righteous it claims to be. The incarnation, God taking flesh, was suddenly the deepest argument for peace. Not peace as absence of conflict, but peace as the presence of a different power, a power that does not need to crush to rule. A power that does not need to humiliate to triumph. A power that enters quietly and changes everything from the inside. The prayer moved through the square like shared breath. Voices rose and fell together, not perfectly, but honestly. Some prayed out loud. Some whispered. Some mouthed the words without sound, letting the syllables form inside them like a private vow. The cold did not disappear, but it became less important. The crowd's unity was not emotional. It was rhythmic. And that rhythm revealed something the modern world forgets: stillness can be action. The global broadcast made the paradox even more striking. Millions could be watching. Cameras could be transmitting every gesture. And yet, outwardly, almost nothing was happening. No dramatic movement. No spectacle. Just a man praying and a crowd answering. And yet the shift was unmistakable. Because prayer is not entertainment. It is alignment. It gathers scattered hearts into a single direction. It turns a mandate into a plea, and a plea into courage. The Angelus made silence into a doorway. Not an empty doorway, an open one. A place where people could step out of their hard-edged identities and remember, even briefly, that they are not self-made, that they are loved first, that peace is not sustained by adrenaline but by grace and discipline braided together. When the prayer reached its end, the square did not snap back into ordinary noise. It remained held, as if everyone understood that words spoken after this needed to be chosen carefully. Then Pope Leo XIV offered the closing blessing. It was ancient, drawn from Scripture, and because it was ancient, it carried the weight of having outlived countless empires and conflicts. It had been spoken over people who went home to ordinary lives and over people who went home to war. It had been spoken over the faithful and the doubtful. Over children and the dying. Over those who would keep their promises and those who would fail. He spoke it slowly. Deliberately. Not as poetry. As commissioning language. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May He let His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. May He turn His gaze toward you and give you peace. That final word, peace, did not land like a decorative wish. Not after everything that had come before. It landed like a charge. As if the blessing did not end the event, but began the year. As if the Lord's peace was being placed into the hands of ordinary people and sent out into their ordinary conflicts, into the places where peace would be tested immediately, the airport line, the family kitchen, the workday pressure, the old argument waiting like a familiar trap. And here, finally, the title resolved itself, not as a clever phrase, but as a lived definition. The silent power of peace is restraint with purpose. Mercy with strength. The courage to stop violence before it begins, not only in nations, but in the heart where violence first rehearses its lines. It is the refusal to be ruled by fear. It is the willingness to forgive without pretending the wound never happened. It is the insistence that the other person is still human, even when they disappoint you, even when they threaten you, even when they are wrong. That kind of peace is not weak. It is demanding. It is costly. And that is precisely why the world resists it. Because it cannot be performed. It cannot be faked for long. It requires a real conversion, quiet, steady, daily. The Pope's voice faded. The moment concluded officially. Such moments conclude. The cameras captured their final angles. The square remained the square. And then the crowd began to move. Not rushing. Not scattering like people released from boredom. They dispersed with the slow, practical motion of pilgrims returning to life. Scarves adjusted. Gloves pulled tighter. Phones lowered and put away as if recording was no longer the point. Some people hugged briefly. Some stood still a moment longer, as if reluctant to lose the interior quiet they had been given. Footsteps spread across stone like water. And as they left, it became clear the event had not merely marked the new year. It had altered the way the year could be carried. Because the page had turned, yes. Quietly, without asking permission. But this time, meaning had followed. Not as a feeling. As a responsibility. As a heartbeat, steady, silent, alive, going with them out of the square and into the places where peace would either become real, or become just another word said at the beginning of a year that changed its date and nothing else. Before you go, kindly subscribe. It helps the channel grow and guarantees you never miss the next release.